It's great that after a full week we finally have some more or less local talent to represent this tiny, tiny country. Just a bit of square miles to its name. Please welcome Mr. Jeremy Greenspan. The reason why he's here is not only because he's Canadian, that would be way too simple. There's another 30 million, you know how many? Yeah. So there must be other reasons, and it is not just because, just about. We might turn a blind eye there. And I guess it's pretty fair to say that especially in remix format, there was not a single packed dance floor in the last 12 months where your voice has not appeared in All Worlds 4/4. But he did original music as well before someone started to remix it. And that is not the interesting factor in itself either. But I guess through your stories that you're going to share and maybe some hands-on things with the lovely little piece of German engineering over there, or pieces rather, a lot of in your stories will actually speak ideally to a lot of people, because it's not, I mean, Hamilton, Ontario is not exactly London's West End.
That's right, yeah.
Should
probably use this thing, yeah.
Yeah, that would be a helpful thing, yeah. You can really tell he's got stage experience. Yeah. So, but, I mean, the name Junior Borzone might be a bit confusing to some, because there's been a couple of sayings, and we got a lot of ooh here. And, I mean, there's been a label that's been hinting at that. I mean, it's junior and boys and all that kind of thing. It's like a... Are you doing lads music?
No, you know, I didn't even think about that label until about, like, I don't know, after we had released something and someone had mentioned it to me. And I said, oh yeah, that was kind of dumb. But by then, the name had already kind of stuck, so I'm sort of always hoping that we don't get sued by Underworld or whoever runs that label. I can't remember.
Terry Farley.
Yeah.
So, when you finally released something, it's probably interesting to know that you guys did not just appear out of thin air last year or the year before that, but you've been, I mean, the name or the project itself existed for quite a bit before that, right?
Yeah, I think the first stuff that we ever did would have been a couple years ago now, I guess. I suppose almost 5 or 6 years ago. The first thing we ever released as Junior Boys was in 2003. So.
But you actually started doing stuff in the old millennium, right?
Oh yeah, certainly. But nothing that was would have been particularly interesting to anybody. You know, like lots of people, I've been making music and stuff since I was a kid, and when we did the Junior Boys thing, it was kind of a deliberate sort of idea as to sort of we wanted to do something very specific, I think, and so that came about, I suppose, probably around 2000 is when we would have started our first couple of tracks, which none of which were ever released. But even by the time we had released our first album, some of those songs on the first album were kind of, I think our first album was kind of a collection of songs that we had written over the past year or two beforehand. So some of them are pretty old, yeah.
So luckily we yesterday passed the lovely town of Hamilton twice on our way to the Niagara Falls.
That must have been great. That must have been great for you guys.
It really was a shattering experience, yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess there's a little bit more to the town than those plants that you see that dominate the skyline, is there?
No, that's about it. But musically speaking, Hamilton is, I suppose it's, not particularly interesting, but there's been a couple of bands who've come out recently. One whose shirt I'm wearing right now, Caribou, He used to be called Manitoba. Now he's called Caribou, and he's from Hamilton as well. And
who's just done one of the more interesting albums of this year.
yeah, pick up that album. And then there's a guy, I don't know if you guys know, there's a label called Stone's Throw, which is a good hip hop. And there's a guy named Koshek who's also from Hamilton, and he's on that label. And I think he's about to be releasing his first album pretty soon. But he's had a couple of EPs and did stuff with Percy P and stuff like that. Anyway, we all kind of grew up together and all friends, and so kind of representing our hometown to some extent.
So if I put my journalist hat on now for a second, I'd be going like, hang on, Caribou, Koshik, Junior Boys, there seems to be like a certain shared love for melody and classic pop and just empathy and pathos to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly depressing city, I suppose. It's got that sort of, it's kind of a Canadian version of, it's kind of like a Canadian version of Pittsburgh or something like that, or maybe in England, Sheffield, or one of these kind of very industrial sort of cities with unusual, strange kind of people. But I think what makes it interesting for me and why I choose to still live there is the fact that there's no particular pressure in the city to be part of a particular scene or a particular genre. When I first started making music, electronic music, dance music, and stuff like that, the notion was that you're going to try and make some music that kind of apes something that's going on somewhere in a much more exciting place. You're gonna.
You mean like Basel in London 25 years ago?
Yeah, exactly. Like basically, you sit there and try and make, I don't know, you're going to make drum and bass records, or you're going to make Detroit techno records or something like that. And it just doesn't make any sense. You're in this city where you have no context or contact to what's going on in London or something like that. And try and make this music that's kind of their music. And in general, those kinds of scenes tend to be extremely insular. They have their own crew of guys who make that kind of music, and generally speaking, outsiders don't usually become involved all that much. And I remember at the time there was kind of a crew in Toronto. There would be these sort of Toronto drum and bass producers, or Toronto. Detroit techno producers, and the whole thing always seemed kind of pathetic to me. These kind of people doing something that really wasn't their own; it was someone else's. So, I think what was good about being in a city like Hamilton is that there was no pressure for me to try and fit into any kind of particular sound. So, I sort of feel as though we were able to make a kind of music where, it doesn't. Categorically fit anywhere in particular, which is, I think, a positive thing.
Still it's definitely a different thing compared to, as we learned earlier, making music with people or for people who buy the chicken at the same kind of place. But definitely there's a bit of an influence, which is kind of obvious there as well. It's just that those people are rather...
We definitely wear our influences on our sleeve, definitely. We sort of... there's certain types of music that we grew up with. And from record to record, actually, from our first record, we had a sort of very particular sound and a very particular kind of set of influences that we were interested at the time. And then when we did our second record, which is... We only have 2 records. Our second record... we were listening to sort of different stuff, different material, and I think the record sounds different because of it. But hopefully, you just sort of become confident, thinking, well, if I make it, it's going to be me, it's going to be us, it's going to sound like us. So you don't have to worry too much about whether or not you sound like yourself or not. Because I was initially worried, thinking, gee, this second record doesn't sound like the first record. I hope that the people who like the first record also like this one. Which could be a little bit stressful, but you just sort of choose to ignore it after a while.
Shall we maybe get a bit of an example of how that evolution went, so that it's slightly less abstract for people who did not follow?
Oh, I would, but I don't even have any of my own music here.
Okay, so we might just have to get back to the humming state of things.
Oh yeah, sure.
You played earlier on while we were at lunch a couple of influences that, as you said, you are wearing on your sleeve. Can you probably just give us a bit of a medley there and run through it?
Sure. Let's see. Well, when we first started making music as Junior Boys.
I'll probably hang on for a second.
Sure.
You always talk about we, and the lineup has changed slightly over
Yeah,
the
that's
years,
right. When I started the band, it was myself and a friend of mine named John. And then, it's sort of a long story how we got signed and all that kind of stuff. But
I guess there's something interesting in that story, because I mean, it wasn't like you went up to your local record store and there was the guy who signed it, but.
Okay, yeah, well, I could tell that story if you want.
I mean, that's a situation where quite a few people will find themselves into.
Sure, okay. Well, basically, I started the group with this friend of mine named John, and I was at university at the time, and we just made music, as most people do, just for fun, and with no real ambition to do it professionally or anything like that. Anyway, I have a friend who, at the time, actually, you just had, the last speaker was on Tempo Records, right? Right, so my friend is a guy named Steve Goodman, who runs a label called Hyperdub Records, which you might know, I don't know. His name, he goes by the name Code 9. Anyway, he used to run a website called hyperdub.com. I don't know if hyperdub.com even exists anymore, but anyway, it did for a time, and he would sort of run articles. He's a guy that I used to live in England when I was about 17, and we lived together. So I met him when I was pretty young. Anyway, I had made this music, this stuff under Junior Boys with my friend John, and he asked me if I would send him, I think, 3 songs. One of which, called Birthday, ended up on our first album, and actually was the first song that we ever released. Anyway, we put it up on this website, and he put a little interview with me and so forth. And what happened was a couple of journalists, British journalists mainly, started sort of writing on their own blogs online. I think this was at a time when I guess blogs were quite new. Started writing about our songs online and posting links to it and stuff like that. And so, unbeknownst to us, sort of, it started generating a little bit of very kind of minor press through these internet sites. And enough so that I started getting requests from journalists. I'd get these weird emails that would be like, "Hello, I write for such and such magazine, and we've heard about you, and we want us to send you, we want a CD," thinking that we had released something. So I would, I'd send them these like CDRs with like my little hand drawing or something like that, and say, "Hey, go nuts." It started getting reviews, which was the weirdest thing. I didn't think, like, who gets a review for a CDR that they send off in the mail? So eventually I got an email from a guy named Nick Kilroy, who was a completely manic guy who said, who sort of said, "Listen, I work for Warp Records. You guys probably know Warp Records. And we're going to do a whole bunch of 12 inches of unknown groups, and we want you guys to be one of them." So I said, "Sure, that sounds great." At this point, I was, I had absolutely no thought that I was going to be doing music. Applying to schools and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, eventually, he started emailing me all the time, this guy, Nick. And eventually, it sort of came out that he said, "Well, listen, Warp isn't going to do this after all." And to this day, I kind of have the feeling that he made the whole thing up to begin with. But
would people on the internet ever do such a thing?
I mean, he did definitely work for Warp, but I don't know if he was ever really an A&R guy or...
Someone needs to take out the trash.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so he eventually quit his job at Warp Records in order to start his own record label, which he did. He started this record label, which he called Kin, and the first thing that he released on it was an EP of ours, which was the song Birthday and a couple other songs. And at that point, my friend John had gotten a very sort of high-powered job in the video game industry, where he still is, and so he left, and so Nick sort of, and at that point I didn't have any expectation to do anything else, but then Nick came to me and said, "Listen, do you think you could do a whole album?" So I said, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." So I then recorded the rest of what became our first album. And sort of at that point, I asked my friend who I'd done music with basically my whole life since I was a kid, his name is Matt Didemus, to help me finish this record. And since then, Matt became sort of the other part of the band. And we finished an album, and it was called Last Exit, and we released that through Kin initially in Europe, very limited release. And then it was through that release that we eventually, the album got picked up by a much bigger record label, Domino Records, who is our record label now. They initially were just a label that just licensed us through Nick, but then Nick sadly passed away, and then eventually we just sort of turned over to Domino Records. So that's sort of how we ended up on that.
Can you probably explain a little bit more what's the difference as an artist to be on a label and then being licensed through another label? I mean, that sounds a bit like human trafficking.
Basically, it's just a sort of a music business thing. I mean, basically, you have the option. Sometimes people like to own all of their own material and then have the option to license their sort of, it's almost like, think about it like sort of like lending your music, so to speak, for a limited time to various record labels and who operate in certain territories. So, for example, you might be a German musician and you own all of the rights to your music, and you say, I want this music to be released in Canada, so you find a Canadian record label and you say, I'm going to license this album to you if you'd like it for a certain fee, and you have the right to release it exclusively or maybe non-exclusively in your country for a limited amount of time. It's very attractive for, I would say, most people, but for people like me who don't relish the idea of being involved in the music industry, so to speak, having to deal with those kinds of decisions all the time, because that's what that requires. Often a better option is to sign with a record label for the world. In those kind of situations, you want to find a record label that you really, really like, or who really, really likes you, and that are filled with nice people, and people are excited about you, and kind of sign your life away. That's sort of what I did.
This whole territorial thing, to which degree does it make sense with a lot of the business swapping over to the internet as the main carrier?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on, even on the internet, I mean, from what I understand, most internet sales happen through iTunes, and iTunes still exists on a territorial basis. There's iTunes Canada, iTunes US, and all of that licensing all works through on that sort of territorial basis. So I think, for example, when we sell records on iTunes, and actually we've been very fortunate that we have a very large proportion of our record sales actually happen through iTunes. They've been very kind to us. I think the way it works is that you Yeah, you have to license your stuff to iTunes on the basis of what country. And I don't think they even have relationships. Well, I'm sure they have relationships with each other, but it doesn't work that if you are on iTunes Canada, automatically you're going to be on iTunes US or iTunes Europe.
Well, without turning this into a commercial, when you said earlier you don't have any of the music with you, can we probably get your computer, because it's set up to the internet, and use it as a means of playing some of the music?
My music, yeah, sure.
Yeah, because I think
Sure.
it's easier if we just take one that's set up.
Yeah.
Right. It's just my dodgy way of seeing how the game is running, but don't worry. Sorry, I'm unplugging this, so there might be a hum.
Who's winning? Who's playing anyway?
It's still 0-0.
Is this German league? Is this like two cities no one's ever heard of, like Freiburg versus Regensburg or something?
Yeah, it's even worse. It's like it's even worse. It's like the bottom of the second division, so you don't want to know. But yeah, Yannick, if you see this, we're gonna whoop your ass. Because it's his team against my team, and it's the 81st minute, and it's still 0-0. It sounds like an exciting game, huh? Yeah. Oh, there we go.
I don't think there's any music on our website is terrible.
Yeah. There's this other thing with like, what's it like? The one, that promotional thing. For
MySpace.
No,
Oh.
not that one. No, the promotional thing for the tour where you're like.
At the video competition thing?
Yeah, that's.
Oh, this is goodbye.com, that thing.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, this is like that's like basically what happens there is that we're like kind of guinea pigs. So Domino will hire some guy who's really good at doing stuff on the internet, and they're sort of like, let's make a Junior Boys website with this guy who like can make bubbles that talk or something.
But what's it called? Because there's lots of music on there.
Is there?
Yeah. And there's also this other thing where there's like 2 full live concerts as well.
Okay, you know it all better than I do.
You know.
Oh, Fab Channel. Yeah, that's not a good one to use because I forget all the lyrics of that concert.
Well, there's 2 concerts. So
Yeah, both of them are terrible. But
it's for concerts that are screened out of Amsterdam, maybe.
yeah,
As
at the Paradiso Club, which is a beautiful club, really really old club.
What's the name of
So this is goodbye.com.
Okay.
Is that, or you could just go to our MySpace page, I suppose. I guess I probably should have brought my own music, yeah. Instead of like
No, but I mean that's
instead of like setting up all of these orchestral maneuver in the dark tracks that probably nobody wants to listen to.
well, there's nothing wrong with that. But the only thing that I find quite interesting is like, I mean, when you say you're born in '79, and then listening to the thing, like the first thing that really pops up is Tora, and
Yeah.
Vince Clarke, and
Yeah.
like, I mean, did you have like an older brother who was into that kind of stuff? Or?
No, but I kind of got into that stuff through another guy that I there's a guy who his name's Mark Fisher. He runs a website called K-Punk, which is a really good website. And he sort of taught me all this kind of stuff when I was about 16. But I sort of came to new wave and sort of 80s synth pop music through dance music, because most people who I listened to who made dance music were. There's a stop button. Just make that go away. Most people who traditionally I listen to, old Detroit and house producer, early house producers, stuff like that, are all a generation older than me. Sometimes two generations older than me. And those are all people who would have grown up listening to Giorgio Moroder or Vince Clarke or whoever. And it was sort of through those kind of people, it's sort of like that thing of, hearing Japan samples and Goldie records, stuff like that, that got me kind of interested.
So it's actually like the same way as people would get into soul and funk music through listening to hip hop.
Exactly,
really.
yeah. That's exactly right.
I mean, the one thing that, at least from afar, like for your sense of space and distance, cities like Detroit and Chicago are relatively close to where you grew up.
Yeah.
How big was the interchange between those scenes here?
It was really big for me. in Hamilton, there was basically in Hamilton, there was a close proximity to Detroit. Basically, I'm assuming most of you guys probably know who Richie Houghton is. So Richie Houghton and John Acquaviva and those people owned a record label called Plus 8, which is out of Windsor, Ontario, which is about 2 hours from Hamilton. And there was a Hamilton label called Steel City Records, which sort of was run through Plus 8 and Probe and all of those.
Can we get some more laptops up here?
All of those networks. So every Friday night at this one club, they would bring another Detroit techno DJ up. What are you doing?
Just trying to make this a little bit more.
He's got my music. That's what's going on there.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. So every Friday night they would have another Detroit techno DJ that you'd get guys like sort of lesser known guys like Ox 88 and D-Win and those kind of people, and then they'd bring up, Derek May would come or Jeff Mills would come, but often Richie Houghton would come and play. And so I remember seeing Richie Houghton playing. It was one of the first things I ever went to as a kid. I went probably in the early 90s. I was probably 15 years old and went to see Richie Houghton play at a little club in Hamilton where they had done everything. They put plastic all over the walls and and everybody was kind of losing their minds on Red Bull. And and that was sort of how I got indoctrinated into that world, so to speak.
But interestingly, because you mentioned Stones Throw earlier, in the same way as those guys are probably, Koshik is not a good example because stylistically he's slightly off their usual radar, but in a similar way as most of these guys are a lot closer to the original roots of funk and soul music, you are actually a lot closer to the roots of those DJs that you liked. In your music, you'd like you went to the same school as Richie, but and there's a lot more of that influence than, let's say, the latest Minus release.
Yeah, I think partly it's partly that's just what I've immersed myself in more lately. I find that on the last record, for example, I listened to almost the main impetus for the last record was sort of late disco and early house music, and so I suppose that kind of influence is what would have been the influence for early techno records as well. I just wasn't making techno music, I was making my own music, but kind of coming from a similar influential place, I suppose.
Should we probably unplug this again? That's great how it works. I love this little art. Right. I've been working as a waiter for long enough to do this, don't worry. So, which one to pick?
These are all from my second record.
Well, what do you expect? You turn up here.
I know.
It's like now you're complaining. There's even the remixes. So.
Oh yeah, I even got the remixes. I don't know. I guess. Why don't you play? Actually, you know what? I'm gonna play something first. Okay. I'm gonna play something first.
Do we need to get some more computers first?
Yeah. No. This will be right. I'm gonna play you guys some early house music that influenced a lot of what was happening on our latest record. So maybe it'll give you guys some sense. Nice. This is a totally classic house track that you probably all know anyway. I'm not gonna play the whole thing because it's like 8 minutes long. How does this work? Like when you guys have like 8-minute songs, you just play like 2 minutes of it or something like that?
Just get to the essential bits.
Okay. All right. Well, this is Jamie Principle with Frankie Knuckles, Your Love.
Yeah, Jamie Principle, wherever he is these days.
Yeah, God knows. So I'll just play you 2 seconds of, here's me patently ripping them off. You get the idea.
Yeah. But there's also a bit of OMD involved, and especially later on when you start singing and all that. Yeah.
I mean, the thing about those Jamie Principle, and the thing that excites me about early house music and sort of late disco, early 80s disco, is the way in which the music was sort of in between genres. So there was a time at which people were making house music, when they were making it for the Warehouse Club in Chicago, or making it for the Music Box Club in New York, or the Music Box, or making it for the Paradise Garage, or all of those kind of clubs, when there was no sort of rules and there was no sort of set guidelines for what the music was supposed to be. It was called house music because it was the music that was played at the house club, and they just thought, I suppose, that they were making disco music. And what's exciting for me about that time is that no sort of genre had actually coalesced. So there's a total feeling of free experimentation. And I think that's the sort of moment that I'd like to try and capture to some extent. I don't think of us as making retro music. I don't try and ape particularly those kinds of songs verbatim. I think in order to do that, I'd probably have to get a whole bunch of vintage equipment and do it and set the conditions up to do it the way they did it and stuff like that. I tend to like to use new stuff and to try and be forward thinking and think about making stuff that's as contemporary as possible, but with the notion that what I take from that moment is the sort of the sense of freedom about it, and the sense of just kind of total experimentation, yet trying to make music it's pop music, that's not alienating, that's not particularly difficult for a dance floor or for a casual listener to understand.
So it's a lot more about the general aesthetics rather than fetishizing about a certain piece of equipment or the actual sound.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when we started making music as the Junior Boys, it came out in about 5 or 6 years ago. I think at the exact moment when we did our first release is when there were bands coming out, these sort of bands from Brooklyn or stuff, who kind of were doing a lot of sort of 80s aesthetic music, the sort of electro clash music and stuff like that, which I had an immediate sort of distaste towards, because I thought that the whole thing was sort of trying to be ironic and trying to sort of this sort of that kind of 80s aesthetic of there's certain types of 80s music which I don't have a particular affinity towards, which is sort of that sort of very rigid electro music where they sort of sing about kind of being in sports cars and smoking cigarettes, and like that that whole 80s vibe, which I had no particular interest in. For me, the music that I liked, I thought was actually fairly emotionally sophisticated. Bands like Japan and Ultravox and stuff like that. And I didn't really particularly want to be lumped in with anybody who I thought was sort of kind of making fun of the 80s. That sort of never interested me.
But I mean, I guess it was kind of hard for you guys, because obviously, as the listener, you're like, oh no, here's another one of those, and you have to overcome this kind of prejudgment of hang on, but there's something different about these guys that sets them apart from the also ironic asymmetric haircuts.
I think with us, we've managed to avoid most of that by the fact that, first of all, when we came out, we had such a sort of R&B influence and such a sort of, that sort of, it was just the aesthetic of what we were doing was, I think, too rooted in what was happening. There was basically, was not faithful enough to the 80s for people to particularly to say they were an electro clash group or something like that, as opposed to some of the other bands where, they have these sort of, it's all 808 drum machines and.
You mean you actually liked something that
happened after
86?
1986? Yeah, exactly. So I think that because of that, we managed to never actually be lumped in with that. But at the same time, I'm kind of glad that stuff seems to have waned in popularity somewhat.
Well, ideally, yeah. It doesn't really take a doctor's degree in psychology to figure out that there's a great deal of melancholy involved in these kind of things as well. Now, again, from the outside looking in, Canada might strike you as a place where melancholy might hit you now and then.
Yeah, it has that sort of northern, that kind of northern flavor. Like, that's why, it's funny that when we go abroad, usually we seem to be most popular in other northern countries. For example, we've done really well in Sweden, and in Sweden and Norway, and to some extent in Germany, places where it's conceivable that people could be quite depressed, and where it gets cold at night and so forth. I'm not a particularly depressive person. I get asked that quite a bit, but I think I like to write songs that I think that are somewhat emotionally honest, and I think most of the time when people write songs, often love songs or something like that, the tendency is to write very overwrought emotions. They're about like immense, enormous pain or overjoy, which to me doesn't really speak to the reality of what day-to-day life is. Day-to-day life, I think, is usually some sort of assemblage of very small, imperceptible emotions often, and things that are usually, somewhere between being overjoyed and sad, and so I guess the word melancholy, people sort of just use that word to sort of as a blanket almost for what I think day-to-day life actually is. And for me, writing the album, I was trying to sort of speak emotionally about things that were part of my daily life, which is why so much of the record is about being on highways or being in sort of a suburban zones and places like that, because that's where I'm from, and that's my routine, so to speak. And those things sort of speak to me emotionally. I think that's people forget that people who grow up in places like Canada also have emotional lives too, and their emotional lives are usually dependent on all of the experiences that they have. And I think if you live perhaps in a historical city, a city of great significance like New York City or something like that, then you have a lot of emotional attachment to things that for the whole world are iconic. You can sing a song about, just take any kind of like, just sort of thinking like any sort of Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen kind of, song about like being on whatever 42nd Avenue, or a song about Broadway or something like that the whole world can understand and relate to, because they're these iconic things. But for the rest of us, we have our emotional lives that are attached to places that are sometimes neither here nor there. They're the mall that you went to when you were a kid, or the highway that you drive every day, or something like that. And to me, I thought making a kind of romantic album about those spaces was kind of more honest. It was sort of about what I was talking about earlier, about trying to not pretend to be anyone that you're not in your music.
How many people are living in the GTA?
In the GTA, which Hamilton's not part of yet, the GTA would probably be, I would assume, around 4 million, probably 4 or 5 million.
Montreal?
Oh, Montreal's maybe 1 million or 2.
Vancouver?
Vancouver is probably about 1 million. I think Calgary is just overtaken. Calgary is the largest growing city in the country.
So you got 4 cities which combine 7 million, and you got 30 in total, and a landmass that is, 4 or 5 times the size of Europe?
Yeah, I mean, it's
so what happens
remarkable.
In the rest?
I think there's a particular thing. I don't know. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that most people in the room have not done a massive American road trip at any point in their life. But I don't know. Has anybody ever done that? You have? Okay. Well, the experience of driving in America is an interesting one because, America is a big country. Not as big in landmass as Canada. It's a very large country. Just so everyone knows we're bigger. But anyway, the interesting thing about being in America is that you can drive in any direction. You can take any highway you want, and you're going to end up somewhere. You're going to end up maybe in California and Los Angeles. You're going to end up in a city or a state or a place that you have some understanding of where it is, with a community there, with a culture there, with a group of people that, any direction you go, there's going to be, you will end up somewhere. Canada is completely different. If you drive, for example, if you drive on any other highway aside from the one that goes to Toronto, you will end up in the middle of nowhere. And it's a kind of nowhere that your mind can only begin to understand. That I urge any of you. You're lucky that you're actually in Canada for arguably the most beautiful time you could possibly be here. And I'd be remiss, I suppose, am I the sole Canadian person?
No, there's going to be more.
Okay, good. Well,
you can fly the flag.
I'll fly the flag anyway. And if you have the chance to go up north at some point and to go to, something like Algonquin Park or something, or Temagami. When I was a kid, I used to go with my parents to Temagami, which literally you can go into a lake and go camping, and there's not going to be another person for, 200 miles or something. You can go to Algonquin Park. Algonquin Park is probably bigger than Germany. It's nuts, and it kind of, I remember a couple months ago I was flying to Vancouver, and you get out of the plane after your 6-hour flight, and you instinctively look for your passport, and then you go, oh my gosh, I'm in the same country, I totally forgot. Which I think Americans can understand that sense to some extent. I think Europeans have zero idea as to what that possibly means.
For us, we only got car-wise, apart from Montreal and stuff, we only got like 3 hours north so far. And even there, Europe, you would have passed about 82 different countries already.
Exactly.
And had to learn, I don't know how many different languages and dialects.
Yeah.
And there you just see this road, which just has to go through this really tough granite kind of stone, where you can really say that it takes them ages and loads of money to just like dynamite it, the road through this nature. And all of the cities are down here, and what's the psyche behind knowing that there's so much of like what's you and your heritage just
I think your
until the
notion
pole, really.
I think your notion of distance is much different. I think especially European. I dated a girl who who was from England, and her grandparents lived in Manchester, and until they were 80 years old, they had never been to London in their life, which I thought was pretty incredible. It's for those who don't know, that's maybe like a 3-hour drive or something like that. I don't know maybe 3-4 hour drive. To drive from here to Vancouver would take like 4 or 5 days or something like that. I think the sense of distance is the central one, but I think what for me I love about this country, the thing that interests me, should I say, is that when you are here in this part of the country, and don't forget that this is the most densely populated part of Canada, between here and Windsor and the Golden Horseshoe, as it's known, is the fact that you have these cities that are very young cities. They have no real historical rooting in any of the sense that a European city would have or an Asian city would have. And they're kind of seemingly carved out of the wilderness. You guys maybe at some point might be going up CN Tower. I don't know if the Music Academy gets quite that touristy, but if you do go up the CN Tower, you'll see the way in which the city is actually just sort of how green Toronto is, and how sort of it just sort of looks like it's just sort of carved out of a forest. And where I'm from, Hamilton, is much more so because it's actually on the Niagara Escarpment. And all of the cities in the country are like that. And you just need to go outside of the city for 10 minutes and look at a forest and realize that you think to yourself, this empty space goes on for another 1,000 miles or something like that. Gives you a funny perspective. So people have commented that I make sort of Canadian records, and I sort of embrace that to the extent that I like to make records that have a lot of empty space in them.
So in case you wondered what all the semi-esoteric hoopla was all about, in the same way as all that bit earlier wasn't like an iTunes commercial, this wasn't sponsored by the Canadian Tourist Board, but you can actually realize when listening to the music that there's a lot of longing involved, to use another aphorism or metaphor for the melancholy bit. And longing always got to do something with distance and something that you need to bridge. I mean, be it longing for in soul music for I don't know, that love that you lost or that love that you will never get, or I mean even in loads of that 80s music that you're citing, it's always like that distant thing that you're never gonna get through. And you got that in a lot of different aspects involved here, right?
I think car travel is a central theme in a lot of my music. It's partly because I think it's an interesting space. I think it's also the fact that I don't want to make music specifically for dance floors. I don't work at that tempo particularly. But I also don't really want to make down-tempo music, so I sort of sometimes imagine to myself that I make music for the purposes of being in a car. And also because as a touring musician, so much of your life is spent inside of a car that it becomes a central part of your life. I think that...
But how do you avoid the cliches there? Because I mean, it's the usual thing, especially with young, skinny-looking English bands. The first record is all about the girl that works at the counter at the local supermarket, and the second one is all about fights and poos and groupies on tour. And so what's next? There must be more topics then.
That usually by the third or fourth album, that's when you employ sort of a boys' choir, and you make a. Or you get into vaguely esoteric world music. You have sort of a Peruvian nose flautist or something like that. That's usually, I'm sure my fourth album will be stinking it up pretty hard.
Probably getting back to the second one a little bit, just to give you a bit more of an idea for those of you who haven't heard it. Probably we just stick with the same song, because then you just skipped before the voice was coming in.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? Why don't you play this one? Because I was just talking about car travel so much. Yeah. Maybe play the one that's sort of about car travel.
Okay, maybe do this first, because it's kind of probably interesting. And
you want to
when we talk about writing music as well.
Sure.
Of how you go from that obvious kind of head nod to music that you like, that used space in a different sense.
Sure.
And how you do.
But there are certain songs on the record that are kind of about youthful innocence. I think "In the Morning," which was our single from the record, is sort of about kind of that, so to speak, sort of youthful. There it is. Another kind of Jamie principle.
Nostalgia. I got it back. When you say what went wrong with the whole 80s thing and drawing influences from it, what threw a lot of people off with the whole electro clash thing was this massive backlash of rockism. And everything that was bad about rock just brought back with electronically amplified, really.
Yeah.
And now you have to go and perform this stuff in some sort of a live capacity, because that's essentially how people make money these days as musicians. Now, how do you stay away from these sort of rockisms and like, or like?
I think that's a difficult one, and I tend to be a little annoying about these sorts of things. I think, often people ask me about the state of contemporary dance music and contemporary electronic music. And I sort of had a feeling when I was first listening to this kind of music that it was this sort of antithesis to rock and roll. And that was what was exciting about it, that the guitars were over and that rock and roll as a sort of paradigm for making contemporary music was not important anymore, and that we could start from a different place, maybe like a sort of disco place or something like that. And of course that sort of didn't turn out the way I thought it might, and I suppose the way I think a lot of people might have thought of it. And now, increasingly, in dance music even, there's a lot of people making dance music these days that's becoming very popular, where it's very much kind of rock music made with sort of in dance music formats.
Without naming any names, but...
Without naming any French names.
Not any particular names with words that are used in the English language as well, but yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like loads of lowest common denominator stuff, really.
Some of it's very good, and some of it's not very good. But
we're not talking about people who are using stacks of Marshall amps that are not switched on.
Yeah. But for me, I think that when we do live shows, it's difficult, and it's difficult to try and make sure that you don't do Junior Boys of the Rock and Roll Show. At the same time, anybody who's ever gone to a show and seen a guy standing behind a laptop knows how tedious that can be. So if you're going to do live music, and if you want to be a working musician, you have to, or else you're not going to make any money. You have to try and come up with some kind of compromise whereby you're doing something that you believe in, and at the same time you're not alienating people or boring them. So I don't know if we have the perfect balance, but we increasingly are trying to. And we toured the first record, and I don't think we had such a great show on our first record. And so we were very eager to sort of try and change what we had done. And the idea was to make it much more live in terms of, with the first time we toured, there was an element to it there was a sort of karaoke element to it that I was never comfortable with, which is that there was a lot of backing tracks going and essentially playing keyboards a little bit and singing over top of that, which for me, I didn't think that was a satisfying live experience for either myself or for anybody. So the second time on the second album, we decided that we would first of all get our live drummer, which is quite a large decision to make because we don't use live drums at all on the record. But I thought a live drummer provided for us a kind of a flexibility and also an element of fun and something to look at. And with our drummer, he certainly is something to look at. And then to use software.
Def Leppard drummer? Or?
No, he's just, he kind of looks like, well, you should go to MySpace. He'll love this. He'll love me plugging this. MySpace.com FostX, FOSTX, to get some great shots of him. He also he makes music as well, sort of extremely destructive kind of industrial gothic. No, I don't know what it is, but with names that are all in Latin and stuff like that. But anyway, we got him to drum for us, and we wanted him in specific because he wasn't a drummer. He was like an old techno DJ. Or an old techno producer. He did stuff on Plus 8 Records and stuff, and so he would sort of. We thought that he would be coming from a place that could understand us somewhat, and then we just used instead of doing backing tracks, we had stuff going through a sequencer live, so that Matt, who does most of the electronics, had some flexibility to play around.
And then, of course, I just sing and dance around and so forth.
So you said if you want to make a living as a musician, you gotta be touring. A lot of this music actually does provide you some sort of an audiobook kind of play, kind of background. I mean, no, background is probably too negatively connotated, but it's more like a listening experience, maybe armchair headphones, whatever, like a comfort zone listening kind of thing.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you stand there with the stuff that you did in your comfort zone, and you find yourself on a stage carrying some Fender product, a bass or a guitar, a Strat or whatnot.
Rickenbacker.
Some classic rock iconic kind of thing.
Like a big Lemmy bass guitar, which is what I have.
And you look into all these faces and they might enjoy it, but they just stand there.
Well, we tend to choose our live set based on trying to make it as exciting a show as it can be. So we don't play many of our, we had a choice as a group. We could have done theater tours. We could have been one of those bands that does theater tours where you go and you play sort of quieter music and people sit down in theaters, or we could have done basically rock venue tours. And I think we as a band sort of chose to do rock venue tours because I think they're probably more exciting to play. And we choose sets that are mainly our more up-tempo stuff, and we tend to make it even more up-tempo when we play it live. And so usually we can have a fairly raucous crowd. But I mean, I don't think it matters particularly because we've toured with a lot of bands, and I think, people will dance to anything. I mean,
do they actually dance, or is it more the friendly nodding type?
No. We got a full dancing crowd, and I remember we toured fairly recently. We toured in England with Hot Chip. I don't know you guys if you know Hot Chip, and they're a great band. And I remember we were playing in Scotland, and actually I should play you this. Let me just give you this for a sec. Anyway, I was playing this show with them in Scotland, in Aberdeen, and in my life, I've never seen a crowd go as crazy in my life. Just like full on, like people smashing their heads and just losing their minds to Hot Chip, and this is the song that they lost their minds to, and I just think it's hilarious that people were moshing to this. Anyway, people can like mosh out to that, I suppose.
What's it like when you play, let's say, a festival, especially like in the last summers, and all of a sudden you're backstage and you find yourself in the company of all those skinny bands and skinny jeans and stuff, and you're like, man.
I think when we first started touring, we do a lot of press, and you go into a town and there's people who want to interview you and stuff. And the single biggest question that I ever got, and I still get it, but the question I always got when we first came out was, "Oh, I didn't realize you looked like that." I think they sort of expected I would look like a member of Interpol or something, like some sort of ashen, I don't think they were expecting like a sort of tubby Canadian disheveled me, But I think hopefully it's endearing to people that we don't look the part.
So did you ever feel the pressure to get a stylist or like get a haircut and all these other things?
We have these.
Do some skag and go like.
We have these hilarious times. Like every once in a while, they do photo shoots for us. They're always uncomfortable. We've done some really strange ones. I remember they thought it'd be funny if we went into Brooklyn and to go to Junior's restaurant, which is like the most inner city Brooklyn restaurant you could possibly go to. And we went in there with these white suits and like we're drinking milk and stuff like that in this photo. everybody in that restaurant was just looking at us like it was like one of those moments where you walk in and you hear like a needle scratch, you know, and everybody sort of looks at you. And we've done all these hilarious. I remember we did a photo shoot once where it was like 15 people like walking around us with like hairsprays and stuff like that, and then they tell you to pose, and when someone points a camera at me, my inclination is I'm supposed to smile and look at the camera. Like, isn't that what you say? You know, like when your grandma takes a picture of you, that's what you do. So, so there's like hundreds of pictures of us in all these hilarious settings with all this like fog machines and just me going like, you know. So I don't think we've ever worked that way. Like as style icons, I don't think we're anything that I'm sure the label would be much happier if we were. In fact, I shaved. I had. Well, I'm not very shaved at the moment, but anyway, I had a fairly big beard for years, and I shaved it off one day, and one of the guys from the label saw a picture of me, and he says, "I can't believe you changed your look." I said, "My look." I wasn't sure. I didn't know I had to consult you on that.
I mean, what's the feeling when you're there at a photo shoot and you're like, oh, damn, am I going like TLC now? Like, I mean, I have to recoup all these people. Like, I mean, like everyone who's getting me some water here, I have to pay them. And I need to sell like 10 more records for just this one person.
Well,
I can go get water myself.
Well, I think somebody somewhere is under the delusion that we're going to be massive stars one day. And I think hopefully reality will catch up to them at some point, and they'll be satisfied with us just puttering along and being a small little band, which is what we like to be.
So until then, you just use them as a bank with like really shitty interest rates. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, another way of recouping some of that is obviously the remix game, and you had some remixes earlier on. You mentioned your friend Code 9 there earlier. You had a guy from Vienna, Fennesz, as well. And then when you were talking about your Detroit influence, it's not the worst thing in the world to get a Carl Craig remix, is it? No, that was great. You know, with the remixes, a lot of groups have remixes and remix packages and albums these days, and I think what was good for us and I think refreshing for the label was the fact that we chose all of the remixers, and you know, a lot of the bands that will get remixes done. For example, we've done some remixes fairly recently for bands I'm sure who have no idea who we are. But we were lucky enough that we could go to the label and say, listen, this is who we want. And some of them are friends of ours, and some of them are just people that we think are great. And obviously, Carl Craig is a fairly no-brainer for getting a remix done. Yeah, probably for the no-brainer business. Let's get our brain rinsed for a second, because it's the same track that we used earlier. And just as an example, where you could probably break down how that works, because obviously, ideally, most of the people in this room at some stage will get to the point at some stage where they're gonna ring up Carl and go like, "Hi Carl, what you doing?" Like
C squared.
Yeah, C squared. Don't be square. Send us this thing like until next month, and be quicker than with that Tony Allen thing, and like you know, come on, give us the goods. So how does this actually work then? Like these
remixes for this album, we had, let me look there. We had, I think, about 8 remixes done. And the majority of them were done by people that we were friends with. So there's one by Code 9.
But now I'm not in a lucky position to have the phone.
No, that's what I was going to get to, basically, was for a couple of them were people that we were just fans of. The 10 Snake remix, I didn't know him at all. But we really liked he had that track last year, Around the House, which I thought was awesome. And Mars and Jules also. We just wanted to get someone. And then Carl Craig, I mean, Carl Craig was one of those situations where it was just like, you just kind of put out a list of names of who would you like to get remixed and remixed by. And you say Carl Craig, and then presumably someone at the label calls him up and says, "Do you want to do this?" And he says, "How much?" And then it's either yes or no. And that's how it's worked with us. There are people who are very professional remixers and people who do a lot of them. We've done several remixes. I tend not liking to do them. I don't like doing remixes particularly. So there's very few remixes that I've done that I'm particularly proud of. For that reason, I'm very reluctant to do them unless they're for someone that I think is good, or unless, I think with Carl Craig, it's sort of an art form with him. And so...
How would you define that art form there?
Well, he's just, he's someone who's done a lot of remixes, and he does them very well. And he has a sort of signature to them. Of course, when I first heard Carl Craig, this stuff that when I think of Carl Craig, I don't, like these days he has this sort of particular style track that he's been making. But with him, I sort of associate him with that sort of bass bin, all the older sort of kind of pre-drum and bass sort of, I don't know what it is. It's kind of that kind of like breakbeaty, jazzy techno stuff, which is...
You mean all the records that everyone always claims that they have? And
yeah, exactly. No one actually has them.
Play,
yeah,
like Atlas and...
Bug in the Basement and all that kind of stuff. But that's the stuff I associate with him more. So when I think people started talking to me about, Carl Craig, I was like, Carl Craig, really? And then I think they played... I heard a few things before he did he did a remix, I think, of Brazilian Girls or something. That was really incredible. And then he had done... I can't remember. He did a couple of his own tracks like 2 years ago or a year ago that I thought were also incredible. And it's good. He's one of those sort of original Detroit guys who's remained very relevant and sort of exciting.
But what is it like when, let's say you may, in a very unlikely situation that you may have had a drink, you're somewhere in the world, it's 4 a.m., there's a couple of hundred, maybe even thousands of people there, and you're kind of, getting your swerve on. You might be looking at someone and going like, all right, and starting to talk to that person, and all of a sudden you hear...
Are you asking me like dating tips right now? Is that... I don't know where we're going with this.
It's a holistic experience.
Okay,
yeah. And then all of a sudden you hear your own voice.
Oh, yeah. That doesn't happen all that often because, first of all, I don't go out all that often. When that never happens to me in a club. That always happens to me at like the Gap or something like that. I'll be like, fuck it, I'm going to the Gap today. I'm gonna buy a scarf or something I don't need, and that's when I'll hear one of my songs. I just exit very, very quickly when that happens.
Okay, let's bridge a gap there for a second and maybe go into this for a bit.
We had gotten this remix, and we got it while we were on tour. And I heard it on my earphones maybe once or twice. And I sort of said to myself, I don't think I get this thing. I don't get it. And we played in... who are the Germans in the room here? How many Germans are in the room at the moment? I know there's a couple.
One, two.
Okay.
Three.
So we went to Panorama Bar, which... Okay.
Is this where you first heard it?
Yeah. Or Panorama Bar. We played in Panorama. We played in Panorama Bar.
The big room or upstairs?
We played in the upstairs bit, which was it was ridiculous. There was like 700 people crammed into this place.
Which is the small room.
Which is the small room.
And the more conservative one.
Yeah. We're in the more conservative room where there's like a massive photo of a vagina behind us. And
it's Wolfgang Tillmans. He's a Turner Prize winner. So
and we play at like, I don't know, 5 in the morning or something like that. Yeah. An early set. You can explain this club probably better than I can. Have you been there many times?
Well, it depends, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's not that many times, but yeah, I think it's probably one of the more original club experiences that you can have these days, yeah. I mean, Yeah, what's the main room?
I mean,
like for you?
it's a massive. I think it must be some kind of Soviet power bunker or something like that. It's a former power station, so it's enormously huge. It opens probably at like 2 a.m. or something like that, and closes. I think it's open like 1 day a week. It closes at like 9 the next night, and there's all sorts of levels. Like the levels of sort of sexual debauchery that are going on in this club are unspeakable. Like I think our drummer dropped his jacket in the club, and he's convinced that his jacket has hepatitis or something like that. Anyway,
They still keep order. We got kicked out there once.
what's that?
They still do keep order. We got
Oh
kicked
yeah,
out
yeah,
for
yeah.
this,
It's
so
I
don't
mean
worry.
the guys who worked there were great, and I mean it's like we were treated terrifically, and it was really really great. We had a great show, and it was a great time, but it was a very extreme club, to say the least. But that was one time when this thing came on in the main room, and Berghain, I think it's called. What does that mean?
It's like the home on the hill, but that's like you go like an average name for like an average little town, really,
okay.
in a way.
So anyway, it was in that main room, and this track came on, and when it came on with those massive, their sound system is unbelievable, and it came on, and then I think me and Matt were like, yeah, now we get it.
Okay, we try to emulate that. So all the men in the room, please get your shirts off, grow a mustache, and
I think that the thing that makes Carl Craig probably a much better remixer than me, for example, is when I do remixes, often what I'll just do is I'll take a vocal from something and I'll just write a song around it. Whereas he uses, in that song, he uses a lot from the original song. The arpeggio, the string sounds, all of those synth sounds are all in the original song, and yet it doesn't sound anything like the original. So
is there
it's
a
kind of
depressing
ingenious.
element to it as well?
What's that?
Is there a depressing element to that as well?
Yeah. I mean, anytime you get a remix, the depressing part is hearing someone do something way better than your song. But that's something you just got to learn to live with.
So, when you said earlier, like you religiously don't touch the vocals, I mean, is it you really need to get someone else to, like rape your voice and like do something else with it that you necessarily wouldn't do?
Well, it's not a question of not touching the vocals in terms of not affecting them. I'll affect them. In fact, we've done very bizarre things to my vocals over time. I mean, in one of the songs, in our song Count Souvenirs, we have my vocals running through a mini moog, actually. So we do that kind of thing. What I don't do is I don't correct them so much. I don't run them through something like Antari's auto-tune and make them sound perfectly in pitch and stuff like that. But we
Unlike
we
other people with French names whose name we wouldn't.
Well, it's not so. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's more like that's how everyone does vocals. And people will ask us, don't you think there's something dishonest about electronic music or something like that? And I'll say, well, listen to if you listen to the latest, I don't know, Green Day record, who are I guess a punk band, so, and then you listen to a record by like King Crimson in like 1978. You'll notice that in the King Crimson record, there'll be a couple of flubs here and there. They'll make a couple mistakes, Whereas if you listen to the Green Day record, you'll never hear a mistake of any kind. And I can assure you it's not because the guys from Green Day know how to play their instruments better than the guys from King Crimson. It's because everything is going through a processor which can correct every single mistake. And I think that it's funny that people will say these things about electronic music, whereas if you listen to the most rootsy alt-country record that was put out last year, I guarantee you it was done on Pro Tools, and I guarantee you everything was corrected. So I think that's the sort of that's the sort of position that we're trying to sort of be an antithesis to, I suppose.
It's kind of interesting that like in 2007 you're still dealing with these sort of questions of authenticity and honesty in music to that degree, and that like electronic music still has to justify itself. Or on the other hand,
That's the amazing thing. I think that's the thing about when people bring up the '80s to me that I find the funniest is when someone will say, you use synthesizers and make pop music, isn't that a bit '80s? And I said, well, how come no one ever comes up to the new bands that play guitars and say, you guys make rock music with guitars, isn't that a bit 1955, Like, they don't have to deal with those kind of questions. I don't see why I should.
even though, as we learned last week, the most amazing bit is with Mr. Ware, just to feel you and Temptation, like Human League.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that synth there in the back, what do you reckon that is?
The synth in the back of
Or like the background noises?
I have no idea.
I mean, most bets were on either synclavier or something like that.
Right.
But in the end, it turned out to be like 128 layers of 50-piece orchestra.
Right.
It's like, someone had budgets to blow. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
So, but why is there this longing for getting this almost like a knightening? Is that what you say? Like when you get knighted by the queen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but this knightening?
Nightening, yeah.
Yeah. Of like, oh, I am a real musician now.
Yeah.
It's like,
I mean, I have my cousin, David, is a great musician.
why is everyone called John or David? Like, it's like,
Actually, everyone I know is named Matt. But anyway,
yeah.
my cousin, Dave, he's a great musician. He's played on both of our records, and he plays clarinet, and he also plays saxophone and flute. And I'll use him on these records, and let me just play.
You use them?
Yeah, I use them. Let's see where.
It's not a very human concept to use someone.
Well, I employ him, I should say. Here's a song where he does this little bass clarinet bit. I'll just play the little bass clarinet solo, wherever it is. So,
as we learned earlier this morning, is this more like a wobbler or more like a weird doubler, or like all the millions of subgenres and using like a wobbly bass sound?
yeah.
So where does this fall into?
This one, this is, I don't know. This is wobble step. Sure. Anyway, he gets furious when he hears what I do with his, because he's like, that doesn't even sound like a clarinet anymore. It doesn't sound. You could have done that with a synth. And I was like, yeah, but I wanted to, So now I just do it to piss him off. But let me just. You're just talking about musicianship and stuff. Like the most talented musician I know is a guy named Mike Kelly, and he's a viola player from Juilliard, which is the best music school in the world, I guess. And he makes this sort of disco music and plays strings on it and stuff like that, and he does all these incredible sort of string arrangements and vocal arrangements. And he apparently, so the story goes, he had to do a final presentation in Juilliard on the kind of music that he was doing, and came and played them like his sort of disco stuff, and apparently caused a near riot. So I'll play a couple seconds. His band's called Kelly Polar, and here's just a couple seconds of it.
My beauty